All right, hi everybody. Welcome to Anthropology 394, Molecular Evidence for Human Evolution for 2017. This is actually a brand new course, so I'm kind of excited to be sharing this with you. It's being designed to a certain extent a little bit by you guys. I'm really interested in what your backgrounds are that you bring to this course and trying to make it appropriate and accessible and a worthwhile learning experience for all of you. So for that reason, I'm going to need a lot of feedback from you throughout the term, which with the online environment, I think is important anyway, to make sure that we have contact and that you feel like we have a good working relationship and all of that kind of fun stuff for this class. So I thought I'd start by introducing myself. I'm not really in the habit of looking that way because I have a monitor over there, but I'm not really in the habit of doing YouTube style introductions. So you won't see my giant face every week, but I just wanted to start out by saying I'm a real person. I'm a paleoanthropologist by trade. You can call me Dr. Chang. Anyway, what I do is that I primarily study the Paleolithic, the Middle Paleolithic in that time period. I'm a biological anthropologist, and my training is primarily in evolutionary theory and systematics, and in particular, my interests have to do with the classification and evolutionary relationships of extinct hominin taxa. So that has to do with defining what species there are and how they're related to each other and reconstructing all of those relationships. I'm really interested in the nitty-gritty of that. So I'm classically trained as a paleontologist, so I am an osteologist. I study bones and things like that, but I also have this somewhat unusual research background in that I spent several years doing a postdoctoral fellowship in a genetics lab at the University of California, San Francisco, in a completely different sort of research milieu where we were actually studying behavioral genetics of dogs. So it had nothing to do with human evolution, but genetics is something that is very interesting to me, both bench work as well as more computational sort of modeling stuff, which I don't personally do, but I'm very interested in. And one of the reasons why I think this course is so fascinating and so important is that if you're interested in human evolution to a large extent, if you're a biological anthropologist, genetic studies are really where it's at. They're not by any means the only way that we can understand about the past. They're not even necessarily the most important way that we can understand about the past, because depending on what your research interests are, you may be interested in other databases and other forms of or ways of knowing about the past. But it's really kind of impossible to escape genetic studies at this point, if you even wanted to. So there's constantly new headlines in the news, new ancient DNA analyses, new findings where people discuss evidence of archaic hominin DNA that is still hanging around in our genomes today, and how these components from our ancestors in our genomes are how the patterns of variation in these modern genomes reflect our evolutionary history, and the fact that some of us got certain portions of our genome from extinct ancestors like Neanderthals, or relatives, I should say, and some of us got other things. There's a lot of news out there. A lot of it can be very confusing. And part of what I would like to do with this course is not only explore human evolution in a broad sense from a genetic viewpoint, but also to give you the tools that you need to be literate in terms of the genetic literature that's out there today. So that when you see a headline, whether it be about human evolution or whether it be about disease studies in genetics, that you have some frame of reference to interpret those, and that will put you at an advantage to understand these findings and how they're relevant to your life. One of my other major goals with this course is to have everybody come out to being extremely fluent in the scientific method, how we do science, how we report it, and how what you see in the news or in journals or something, you know, the way that people frame news about science may not necessarily be accurate in terms of what we actually know about science. So these are all things that I think it's extremely important for us to understand, and that I would like you to also have the tools to understand when we come out of class today, out of class this term, I should say. Now, this is going to be a pretty rigorous class. Based on the introductions that I've read so far on course spaces, a lot of you don't have that much of a background in genetics, and that's totally fine. It's awesome. I had kind of anticipated this. So the readings and the way that the topics that we're presenting are framed is going to be geared to this during the course of the term. But what this means is that I also need a lot of feedback from you guys if you are confused about something, if you need extra help, if you need another resource to go back and study on your own, if there's a particular topic that you have problems with or that you really have never ever heard about before. Your TA, Lisa Rogers, and I are here to help you with all of that. So for that reason, we have online discussions. There's a new thread started every week where we require you to sort of share your feelings and your thoughts and your questions about the topics for the week. This is going to be an extension of our online classroom. Basically, it's going to be the way that we talk to each other. So there is a requirement there where you get 2 points per week doing this. That doesn't seem like a lot, but it adds up by the end of the term. It's worth half an exam. So if you don't do these discussions, then you're going to be at a grave disadvantage when it comes to your grade. But also because this is a way where we can have a dialogue. A lot of you may have the same questions, and if you ask them there, then we can answer them, in the classroom, as it were. And I would encourage you to approach the readings very thoughtfully and also very critically so that you can see where your personal holes might be in terms of what you do and don't understand, and ask for help right away. Because while this is going to be a class that's suitable as an introduction to basic sort of evolutionary genetics, population genetics, human evolution, ancient DNA, we're going to be covering a lot of topics. It also is going to be fairly rigorous and move fairly fast. So I'm going to need a lot of cooperation from you guys in order to make sure that we are conducting the course in a sense that is useful and productive for everybody. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time going over the syllabus for this reason. I think it's important that everybody reads it. Now, there is a preliminary syllabus up right now. The reading lists will be posted at minimum each week, so cumulatively you will end up with a complete reading list that you can refer to when it comes time for the midterm and when it comes time for the final. All of the readings for this week have already been posted, as well as your assignment for the week, which is due next Friday. And it's really important to check course basis daily. So anyway, I will turn off the camera and start sharing our screen instead, so that you can see what it is that we're doing exactly, and what your requirements are going to be for this class. So let me get that up there. Oops. Let's go back. I think this is trying to automatically play for me. Thank you. All right. So your syllabus has been posted to Course Spaces. All of the important documents and links for this class will be posted to Course Spaces. I won't always announce when I post something. If it's something really important, like a revision of the syllabus or something like that, I'll try to do that. But every little thing I post is not going to merit an email announcement. So it's very important that you check Course Spaces on a regular basis, at least daily, if not more than once a day. Our discussions will also be hosted there, so that's important. There's been a little bit of confusion about the class times because the course catalog was a little bit out of date in that sense. The class times are such that I'll be doing one lecture per week on Fridays. That will be between 90 minutes and 2 hours long. It will take place between 2 and 4 p.m., just like this one is going on, using Google Hangouts and YouTube Live. So what this means is that I'm basically doing a live broadcast on YouTube that is facilitated through Google Spaces, and I've Google Hangouts, sorry, and I've included some tutorials to help you understand exactly what that is in case you want to, but it's not really that important to do that. I'll be providing links to the lectures that you can just click on through YouTube, and you'll be able to see the archived lecture there. So this will be happening every Friday, and you don't have to attend, obviously, but if you do, then you will have chances to ask questions online while I'm actually here, so that might help. In terms of our office hours, they are also online in exactly this venue, Google Hangouts, and by appointment. So all you need to do is email me. If you put Anthropology 394 in the subject line, that will help me a lot because I'll know that I need to answer that much quicker than the other stuff that piles up in my mailbox. And then I can basically meet you online, the link given at the top of this page, and we can talk about any questions that you have. And so if you have really complicated questions or sort of extensive questions about topics that you're not understanding, that would be the best way for us to get you up to speed. Obviously answering those kinds of questions by email and stuff like that is not so easy. It involves a lot of typing. It's very slow. It's not in real time. So I'd encourage you to take advantage of online office hours. I can have office hours at kind of unusual times too, like late at night and things like that. Can sometimes be something that I can do. So, I understand many of you are taking this class so that it will fit into a very crowded schedule. So hopefully that will help in that sense. Our TA, Lisa Rogers, very capable, is also available for help in this sense. So In this class, we don't have a textbook. I'm going to be posting links to readings every week, as well as, online resources that you can use, like online textbooks and stuff like that. You are responsible for looking up many of these sources yourself. So if I give you a citation for a journal article, I expect you to go to the UVic library website and locate and download it yourself. This is in part to help develop your research skills, because this is really a pretty straightforward thing to do and that everybody should come out of their undergraduate education being able to do. If it's something that is not available on UVic, then I will post it directly. For those of you who do well with textbooks and you want to buy one, the one that I would recommend is called Human Evolutionary Genetics. It's the 2014 edition, which is the second edition, and you can buy it in a number of different ways. It's fairly recent, so it's up to date. You can find it used in some places. It's pretty expensive if you buy a hard copy, but you can rent it as an ebook for about $25 through Amazon.com. You can also buy it online from Amazon.ca, and I believe it's about $69 there. So there's a bunch of different sorts of options to get this textbook. The first edition is not suitable. This is one case where you absolutely can't purchase the first edition because it's extremely out of date. It's almost 10 years old, so over 10 years old. So the new one is the one that I would recommend that you use. There are a number of other evolutionary genetics books out there. If you go to a used bookstore and you find one or something, go ahead and buy it. The basic information in it will be correct, particularly if what you really need is a resource to sort of get you up to speed on genetics in general. Those types of sources are absolutely fine. I'll also, like I mentioned, be providing links to online resources that are really useful for this. That will be the ones that I expect you to read for this class and will show up on exams and stuff like that. So we have some of those posted already for the first week. So, as I mentioned, the course is something that you should experience independently. Now, it is not completely asynchronous in that you don't do it completely on your own time, like you don't take exams when you want to and things like that. We have deadlines that it's going to be really important to keep up with. So I would keep track of the schedule on the last page of the syllabus, and also of course spaces as I mentioned before, so that you remain up to date. The timing of the work that you do week to week is pretty flexible. Obviously I don't require you to watch this lecture by Monday or something like that, but it's best to stay on schedule as much as you can, because otherwise you're going to find work piling up, and you will not be able to pile up work week to week, and it's something that I wouldn't recommend that you do even if you could. So remember that you have weekly deadlines. One of these is an assignment, which will be due each week. They run from Friday to Friday, and we'll also be having regular quizzes. So you have to keep up with these sorts of things. Let's see, I mentioned the information about the lecture already. You're not required to log on, obviously. You can review these lectures online at any time. Those of you who've taken classes with me before are already familiar with all of this. And I have provided a link to the lecture catalog at the top of our course spaces page, where they'll all be listed in chronological order for your easy review. Now, in terms of the evaluation for this class, which I know everyone is very interested in, you have a lot of potentially evaluatable activities. And so this is, on the one hand, a lot to keep track of, but on the other hand, gives you many opportunities to keep your grade up. So your entire grade is not dependent on one exam or something like that. So we'll be having an assignment each week. So the first one is posted already. If you haven't taken a look at it, you get a flavor of what we're going to be doing. They will build upon the topics that we have that we'll be discussing in lecture, and also dealing with through readings each week, but will require usually a little bit of independent study, maybe some additional readings and some creativity. So the assignments will vary quite a bit, but will all be worth 10 points each. This in turn adds up to the same amount of points as the midterm and the final put together, so I would not neglect these assignments. We'll also be doing the online discussions that I mentioned each week. So under each week's materials, I will post a discussion thread, a new one, and you're all required to participate in these discussions. And what these discussions should reflect is your online your ongoing journaling and note keeping about the class, which you should be doing throughout the term. So really, these online discussions should be pretty trivial if your goal is to fulfill the requirements so that you get the points. Basically, you just need to share a thought each week with your classmates. Read the readings, see how you react to them. I highly recommend that you take notes while you are reading them, while you are watching lectures, and maybe share an insight that you have or a question or something that maybe I brought up in lecture and you said, hey, wait a minute, I want to know more about that, or what you said was really confusing, I don't understand. Basically this is your forum to participate in the class. And so to get full credit, you need to post at least once. You need to post at least one post, and it has to be substantive. It can't just be like, yeah, it was really interesting this week or something like that. You have to make one substantive post, and you have to respond to at least one other classmate's post, and that also has to be substantive. Like, it can't just be like, yeah, that I agree, or something like that. So you're not limited to 2 posts. You can make as many as you want, depending on how the discussion goes. But for full credit, you need to make at least 2 posts. And if you do all of them, 2 posts each week, then you get a bonus of 5 points at the end of the term. So altogether, this adds up to half of an exam for those of you who are keeping track of points. In terms of your notebook, I'm going to assume that everybody is keeping some sort of journal during the class, that you're keeping notes. I highly recommend that you do this in longhand if you can, unless you have something that prevents you from writing a longhand notebook for a number of different reasons. Probably many of your professors have beat this into your head at this point, but basically, if you write down information with your hand as opposed to typing it on a computer, it transfers the information into your brain better. There's lots of research going into this, so I highly recommend that you do this. So obviously I'm not going to be able to check your journal or grade it or anything like that, but I hope that you're keeping one and that you can use this to share with us throughout the class. And we're also going to be having weekly quizzes. We're not having one this week, but we'll have one starting next week. And there are 10 of them altogether. They're going to be very short, 5 questions each. And they're going to concentrate on the materials for each week, primarily the readings, but also on important points that were brought up in lecture. So this is primarily for pedagogical reasons, basically. Students learn better if you're quizzed regularly on things. It helps you keep up with the course material and stuff like that. And I'll be dropping your 2 lowest quiz grades. If you forget to take a quiz, unless you have an extremely good excuse, like a personal emergency that's a real emergency or something like that, you're not going to be able to make up quizzes. If you skip a quiz, then that will be one of your dropped quiz grades. I don't want you to take this as basically blanket permission to just skip 2 quizzes, because you may find that you would like to drop 2 of your graded quizzes by the end of the term, but you have plenty of opportunities to do better as time goes on. We're also going to be doing 2 exams during the term. There's going to be a midterm and a final. The dates are given in the syllabus and also included on the schedule at the end of the syllabus, and each one will cover half of the course material. So the final exam won't be technically cumulative, but we are covering a lot of really basic topics in the first half of the course, like about how DNA replicates and things like that. So I'm going to assume that you remember that stuff for the second exam, because you will need this information in order to interpret the stuff that we go over for the second half of the course. So while it's not explicitly cumulative, it is kind of cumulative in that sense. And all of these are going to be done online on course spaces. So those of you who have done these before, very familiar. Those of you who haven't done this before, basically there'll be a link to the quiz. The quiz will be open for a finite period of time, for 48 hours over weekends generally. And you can start the quiz or the exam at any time during that period, and you will have a finite amount of time to finish once you start, right? So this way you can fit it in your schedule. You can take the quiz when you have a chance to sit down for 20 minutes or for an hour, depending on whether it's a quiz or an exam. And if you have any sorts of technical difficulties during the quizzes, then you need to let me and Lisa know by email right away. So like if you get kicked offline or something like that, just so we know what happened and it's been documented, and if I need to, I can go back and adjust your grade or reopen something for you or something like that. Now, I have to note that these sorts of problems are exceedingly rare. Pretty much never happens to people. When they do get booted offline, usually you just get right back on and start over again, and it keeps your answers and it's fine. So I wouldn't be scared of technical difficulties, but just in case something happens. Obviously, all quizzes and exams are open book and open note, because I can't stand there and monitor you, but you need to complete them on your own. And you also need to complete them not as group activities. And there are some signatures that can be detected when people are cheating in online quizzes. And if there is any evidence that that this has happened, then there is university policy covering that. So I don't want to spend a lot of time going over the course policies and stuff, but they're here for you to read. The one that I want to underscore in general is the one having to do with conflicts and emergencies. In general, there are very, very, very few excuses that are acceptable for not completing work on time in this class. True personal emergencies, like if you actually have a death in the family or health problems or something that is truly disruptive to your study life, and this does not count like trips for athletic teams and stuff like that, then my policy for this class is for you to contact counseling services and have them also notify me that there is a problem that you're having that that needs to be accounted for and accommodated in the class. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One of them is the obvious one, which is that, you know, you have high grandparent mortality rates around exam times. It seems statistically improbable, but also that if you are having a family emergency, I want to ensure that you get the help that you need, and that's what counseling services is there for. In addition, if you tell them that you're having these problems, they can contact all of your professors for you, so you don't have to do it personally as well. So this sort of notification is necessary to provide extensions, to do makeups, that kind of stuff. So it's very important. Now, the schedule here is on the last part of the class, and you can see where the quizzes are happening, the midterms, all of that kind of stuff. Again, this class basically runs Friday to Friday in the sense that each Friday I will be posting a lecture that goes over the topics for the next week. And then you have, you know, that weekend and the next week until Friday to complete your work and do your assignment and study up for the next quiz and stuff like that. This is to account for the fact that most people don't watch the quizzes immediately after they're posted. In general, you know, there's sort of I'm expecting most of you will probably watch them by, say, Tuesday or something like that. So the the lecture will kind of prepare you. You'll have a bunch of readings and other sorts of online activities that you'll be doing, and then they'll culminate in a quiz and an assignment. And that will happen every week. In terms of the topics that we're covering, these are somewhat flexible. If there is a topic that you would really like to go into that isn't listed here, that you're not sure if it's something that we'll be going over, then you can contact me and let me know. And if it's something that is very relevant to the class and that you have a strong interest in, then we can see if we can include it. And so at the end of the syllabus, I've given you a list of online references that you can use as online textbooks, and these are really actually quite excellent. The open source resources, as well as things that are available through the UVic library that you wouldn't have to pay for other than that you're paying tuition, are really quite good these days. So so I would like you to take advantage of those resources and also save you a little bit of money by not making you buy a textbook. So without further ado, I wanted to go over a bit of an introduction into what this class is, framed in the context of what evolution is exactly and what it is that we're interested in doing. So this class is called Molecular Evidence for Human Evolution. What that means is that we are concentrating on certain biological characteristics, molecular characteristics, by which we mean biological molecules. So these include things like proteins, which are built of amino acids, but they also include the biological molecule of DNA, which encodes our genome, basically, and also directs the production of all of these amino acids and proteins and other biological molecules that make us and keep us running. So there's a number of different lines of evidence we can look at to deduce what has happened in our evolutionary past. You know, we can look at bones, we can look at archaeology, we can also look at biological molecules. And so that's what we're going to be concentrating on in this class. But I wanted to talk about what exactly it is that we're seeking to explain by examining this kind of molecular evidence. And for that, we need sort of baseline understanding of what evolution is, you know, what it is that the theory of evolution is meant to explain, and something about the history of this theory in contrast with previous ways of looking at biological diversity that were non-evolutionary, to put the entire discussion in a historical context before we move on to the rest of the course. So for those of you who have taken a class with me before, this may be somewhat repetitive. For those of you who have taken Anthro 250, you probably went over this to a certain extent in that class as well, but I have never found that it is a bad idea to review this. So to start with, you know, we all live in the Pacific Northwest. I'm in Oregon. I'm probably not going to meet any of you during this term, but, you know, I live up here too, just a little bit south. So if you're like many people living in the Pacific Northwest, you probably enjoy hiking, right? Getting out there into the wilderness and seeing things, at least, you know, in the summer when it's nice outside and it's not raining. So, you know, you can imagine hiking down your favorite trail in the Pacific Northwest. You know, if you don't enjoy hiking, pretend that you do. And so if you look around and you kind of try to take stock of everything that you see that's alive. So like every living thing that you see, that's a lot of living things. There's trees and there's flowers and there's ferns and there's lichens and there's mushrooms and ravens and jays and several kinds of squirrels. And if you're not so lucky, mama grizzlies and angry elk and stuff like that, there's like myriad arthropods like insects and spiders. And God, Oregon, I don't know about Victoria, but Oregon is basically the land of spiders. There's just spiders everywhere here. They really seem like they're without number. And at some point, if you were actually doing this exercise in your head, if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to try to keep a list of every single living thing I see while I'm out here, eventually you would have to stop, because you would not actually get anywhere on your hike if you just were doing this, and you wouldn't be able to remember your entire list anyway. So even though, you're probably sitting in front of your computer, maybe you're on your couch right now, maybe you're sitting in your home office like I am, you may be doing a number of different things, but we're kind of distant from nature these days. But in the not so distant past, humans everywhere, all around the globe, including where we live now, required detailed knowledge about the natural world and about all of these living things around them in their everyday lives. So while this is something we have to sort of step out of our comfort zone to do in our modern Western context, in some places in the world and in our pretty recent evolutionary past, this is very salient information that we needed to understand in order to basically survive. And so when you stop to contemplate the magnitude of data involved here, imagine that your brain is a computer and you're trying to process all of this, which is kind of the way things are. Understanding the true nature of biological diversity can quickly become overwhelming. You have all of these data points, you have all these different organisms, you need to categorize them in your head in some way to start comprehending this diversity and trying to explain exactly what this diversity means, what it means to you, how it affects your life, all of these things. And this is really what the study of evolution was meant to do. So there are two big questions that pretty much any human confronted with the multitudinousness of biological diversity confronts and has to answer, regardless of what walk of life you come from, that we do in the context of a class like this, that you might do in the context of your everyday life if you were a foraging person, if you're a hunter-gatherer. The two big questions are, how is biological diversity produced, and how do we explain the fit of organisms to their environment? So the question about how biological diversity is produced is a question that pretty much every culture out there has an answer to. Some of these are mythological answers, some of them are religious, some of them are scientific, but it's a question that everyone has tried to answer at some point. Where did all these animals come from? Where did these plants come from? What does it mean? I see a horse and I see a dog. What does this mean? Did somebody make these? Are they related to each other? Like, what's going on? This question is one that every culture has sought to answer, sometimes in very basic senses in terms of origin myths and origin stories for themselves as a culture and how they fit into the natural world. The second question is a question about how we explain the fit of organisms to their environments. In other words, there are many living things that seem kind of perfectly tailored to the places in which they live, like torpedo-shaped dolphins, for example. And so trying to explain the fit of organisms to their environment, why did this happen? Did somebody design them this way? Was there a natural process involved? This is another question that people who are interested in biological diversity answer. And so to a lot of people, the nature of biological diversity, when you really start sitting down and observing it, seems to demand a special explanation of some sort or another. In a lot of cases, this fit of organisms to their environment is particularly interesting in the sense. So if you are not familiar with what this weird fish is, this is a kind of fish called a remora, and it basically gets around by hitching rides on larger fish like sharks and stuff like this. And the way that it does this is because it has a suction cup on the top of its head. So you can see that suction cup right there, interestingly enough, and it actually is a suction cup. So you look at this thing and you have to wonder how something like this exists. Most fish do not have suction cups on top of their heads. And so every culture has origin stories that deal with the creation of the world and how everything in it came to be, and these stories can differ quite a bit in their particulars, but a lot of them, some of them fall back on divine explanations, a lot of them are kind of beautiful and lyrical, and they all contain their own kinds of truths, but they're all meant to answer crazy questions like this, like how does that happen? We know, based on developmental studies, that that's actually a modified dorsal fin. So if you have a goldfish in a bowl at home and that little fin that's sticking up in the top of its back, this is a modification of that fin, incredibly enough. But these sorts of things appear to demand special explanations. If you look at other animals in the world around you, it seems clear that a lot of them have characteristics that make sense in terms of the way that they make a living. Birds fly. This eagle can fly. It has enormous wings. It's lightweight. It has hollow bones. All of that kind of good stuff. It doesn't have a bony tail to save weight. It's clearly well designed for what it does. You see something like this gecko that looks like a dead leaf, exactly like a dead leaf, or the fact that a cheetah can run 80 miles per hour for short periods of time. Or then you look at something crazy like the cephalofoil of a hammerhead hammerhead shark, that is what this thing is technically called, is a cephalofoil. And you have to wonder, you know, what exactly is this? And so in many cases, these sorts of characteristics about organisms are the characteristics that we find most striking and that we feel like requires the most special explanation. And these characteristics are things that as biologists today we call adaptations. In other words, Charles Darwin called them adaptations as well, that they were characteristics that seem to especially suit an organism to their environment. And so these sorts of characteristics, and much like the suction cup on the top of Ramora's head, do seem to demand some sort of explanation. So we seek to explain exactly how these sorts of characteristics come about. So in a modern scientific sense, in a modern Western scientific sense, the explanation that we use to explain the biological diversity that we see around us and the patternings of that biological diversity in terms of the distributions of organisms, the ways that they make a living, the features that they have that seem to be well suited to making that living, is evolution. Right? So evolution is the theory, which is a very well-supported hypothesis, underlying these patterns that explain why they are the way they are. And the study of evolution is really interesting because it's highly varied. It involves many, many different lines of evidence and lines of study. And so we know that evolution is the process by which biological diversity is produced. In other words, these are evolutionary forces that have resulted in these crazy sorts of characteristics and patterns and stuff that we see today. So this is the result of evolution and not of alternative explanations based on our scientific understandings. It's also something that we can understand as the grand unifying concept of all biological sciences. And this is why somebody who studies short segments of human DNA, like what you see in the picture in the upper left-hand corner, and spends most of her time in a laboratory pipetting tiny little samples around and putting them on machines that read them, is a biologist, as is somebody who studies the fossil remains of human ancestors, as is somebody who cultures bacteria on plates in the lab, as is somebody who grows plants in a greenhouse, as is somebody who goes out and observes animals in the field and is a field ecologist. When you look at the databases that people look at and the sorts of activities they're involved in every day, it might seem like all of these scientists are not doing the same thing. You know, pipetting DNA samples in a lab is very different from spending your time in the Florida Everglades and surveying the arthropod communities that are associated with mangrove swamps. But they are all biologists. And so biological anthropology is also a biological science, and the explanation that we use to interpret the biological diversity within the human lineage and among human fossils, among modern humans, is evolutionary explanations. So this is something that was contributed to us and sort of codified and formalized by Charles Darwin in 1859 with his publication of On the Origin of Species. And he used this really great metaphor where he explained biological diversity as an entangled bank. So you can imagine being on your hike in the Pacific Northwest again, and you see this bank that's above a stream or something like that. And you'll find that, you know, even that tiny little slice of the natural world has a ton of biological diversity sort of represented there, you know, many different plants, birds, etc., bushes. The bushes themselves, insects, worms, maybe some mammals running around and stuff like that. And he, in his book, presented his argument that there were natural laws, natural processes that always operated in the similar ways that explain the biological diversity around us, and that this was something that he distinguished from alternative explanations like supernatural explanations like special creation and things like that, and that this was the explanation that was the best supported by the scientific evidence that we have, that we had then and that we still have today. So evolution is something that we can think of as both a fact and a theory. We know that it happened based on our scientific findings and, you know, hundreds of years of studies that all point in the same direction. There's also a theory in the sense that it is a very well-supported hypothesis that explains these findings that we have. But this sort of understanding wasn't always present in Western thought. Before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, most biologists or people who studied biological diversity, whether they thought of themselves explicitly as biologists or not, did not think that evolution had occurred. And evolution is something that we can define as the change of biological characteristics over time in populations, basically. So they didn't think that this happened. In other words, they believed that the biological diversity they saw around them was static, that it was created the way that it was and that it had always been that way. So there were three major concepts underlying these interpretations. Biological thought before Darwin had its roots in classical Greek philosophy, as does so much of modern Western thought. So a lot of this is drawn from concepts like the Great Chain of Being or the Scala Naturae by Aristotle that you see being represented on this slide. But these concepts included spontaneous generation, which is the idea that living things can originate from non-living matter. Now, if you go all the way back, in sort of astronomical time, and you look at the Big Bang and the origin of the Earth and all that kind of stuff, then it is clear that at some point living things originated from non-living matter molecules that became assembled in one form or another to become some sort of proto-DNA. But today, if we look at the fully formed organisms around us, you can't make beetles appear out of nothing or out of dirt or rocks or something like this. As an example of sort of misunderstanding of spontaneous generation, the fact that it doesn't exist. My mother, who is an intelligent person but is not a biologist, is not particularly interested in these questions, remained convinced throughout my entire childhood that insects could just sort of spontaneously generate from damp environments. So she would tell me, for example, that I should make sure that there was no leaking underneath the sink in my bathroom, because if it kept leaking, then it would turn into bugs. This was an explanation that she had for the fact that if it was damp, then that would attract insects like beetles or roaches or something like that. But it doesn't actually describe what happens. But so her explanation of these insects showing up if there's a leak on those things is basically spontaneous generation. And we know that that particular thing would never happen scientifically. The second major concept is fixity of species, which means that once formed species, once formed by whatever way these species were formed, they're eternal and unchanging. And so what that means is that, if you see deer in the woods or something and you went back 1,000 years, 10,000 years, 5 million years, as long as these things had been on the earth, they would be the same as what you are seeing today. That biological changes have never occurred in that lineage. And finally, one of the major concepts underlying pre-Darwinian biological thought was the concept of the ladder of life or the great chain of being that I mentioned before. And so this is the idea that all natural forms fall on sort of an increasing scale of complexity. For example, like slugs are lower than lizards, are lower than dogs, and humans usually sit at the top of the ladder in a lot of these configurations. The Aristotelian representation that you see on the right includes supernatural beings in it, right? So you have, as well as non-living things. So you have minerals being kind of at the bottom, and then you have, plants at the bottom. And basically you can see that they are ranked in terms of how similar they're perceived to be to God, essentially, in this scale. And while this is a pre-Darwinian, pre-evolutionary way of looking at the world, it's something that is still around with us today that we sort of unconsciously do in our heads when we categorize the living things around us. You can even see it sort of hanging around in informal classifications that biologists will use when we converse with each other. For example, it's not that unusual to hear anthropologists refer to lower primates and higher primates. This sort of refers to as where lower primates are things like lemurs and other organisms that we often refer to as prosimians that are not as monkey-like or ape-like, and higher primates including monkeys and apes, in other words, primates that are more similar to us. So this even still hangs around in our terminology. Even though we say these words, we know that we don't mean what they seem to say, but they're sort of a shorthand for referring to these different primate groups. So all of these concepts are things that tend to die hard in terms of thinking, the ways that we categorize and conceptualize the biological diversity around us. And if we look at conceptions and misconceptions about human diversity, for example, a lot of these sorts of pre-Darwinian concepts keep coming back and biting us in the butt, really. So even though working biologists don't use these concepts to explain biological diversity to themselves anymore, they are things that are still sort of hanging around in our consciousness in many ways. So over time, people who were interested in biological diversity started noticing some things about the distributions of organisms and also of fossils and things like that, that started throwing monkey wrenches into these sorts of static, unchanging, hierarchical ideas that people had about biological diversity. For one thing, people noticed stuff like the fact that sometimes when you go to the top of a mountain, you see the fossil of a fish up there. Or that, when you dig up a fossil fossil, you find a skeleton eroding out of a hillside, it doesn't always look like anything that still lives. It seems to be some creature that used to live and isn't around anymore, like a dinosaur, something like that. All sorts of data points that were incongruous with this idea that the Earth had been created or formed a certain way and that this biological diversity had been placed upon it and hadn't changed since then. So the doctrine of catastrophism was introduced in order to explain this away in a number of different ways. In this doctrine, basically, the idea is that biological change doesn't occur over time, that once species are created and placed on the Earth, that they stay that way that they've been created as long as they exist, but that the Earth had essentially been reset multiple times since this initial creation, that, there were catastrophes like Noah's flood was one of them, maybe comet impacts, other things like that that were of divine origin, so that you could essentially create a blank slate and then repopulate the Earth with a new set of species, which would also not change during the time that they were on the Earth. And so this is something that seemed to make sense in the context of not only a static and unchanging Earth, with the exception of these occasional resets, but also with an Earth that was rather young. So from medieval times through the late 18th century, the Western world largely believed in the literal truth of biblical scripture. And so if you go by the data that are provided in religious texts, and a guy named Archbishop James Ussher, who was the Archbishop of the Church of Ireland, came up with a really sort of ingenious way of trying to determine how old the Earth was. Basically what he did was that he counted the begats in the Bible. Basically he counted the generations of families that were described in the Bible and tried to determine how long each had lived and extrapolate from there, and actually also collected tons of other data from other texts and cross-referenced it. He did a lot of work really to try to determine exactly if he could sort of go back through time and reconstruct the date of origin of the Earth. And he came up with a date of October 23rd, 4004 BCE, which became theological dogma, and it's why a lot of people to this date believe that the Earth is only about 6,000 years old. Actually, if you have a Bible at home and you flip through it, it might actually have this timeline and that date in the margin somewhere, in the frontispiece or something like that. So this idea that there was a young Earth was coupled with, again, this overall belief that the Earth had not changed during this time, except for maybe these occasional catastrophes and stuff like that, and that this was just the way that things were. But as time went on, more and more evidence was accumulating that made these sorts of interpretations of an unchanging Earth less and less tenable. So this idea of catastrophism was sort of a stopgap in this flow of scientific information that was coming out during the Enlightenment of the 18th century. But eventually this flow of information became strong enough that a lot of thinkers started really questioning the idea that the Earth had not changed. The Enlightenment placed an emphasis on rationalism and empirical thought, and there have been a lot of advances in physics and astronomy, and especially in geology, that were suggesting to people who are paying attention that the Earth that we know isn't actually static and that it's actually very, very old. So around the 1800s, geologists began to realize that the Earth changes over time. For example, they found things like marine rocks in the Himalayas, indicating that those mountains had not always been the way that they were. They found extinct volcanoes in France, that kind of stuff. They started observing processes more closely, like erosion and stuff like that, indicating that, certain landscape features could change drastically within decades. And so that would indicate that, if there was enough time, big changes could occur. They also looked at the importance of fossils and their distribution. They'd known about fossils for some time, ergo the doctrine of catastrophism, but a lot of these fossils were explained away as either just weirdly shaped rocks or, again, the remains of animals that were wiped out during catastrophes like Noah's flood or something like that. But if you looked at the distribution of these fossils, geologists started to notice that it wasn't random. So they would do things like look in deeper layers of Earth, like basically if you dug down further, the fossils in many cases tended to be simpler. This is especially true if you're looking at invertebrate taxa like shelled animals and stuff like that. And they found that, the closer that you got to the surface while you were digging, the more and more and more fossils looked like what we saw today, that they would in some cases be sort of these graded series of change over time. They also found that this distribution from top to bottom in some cases seemed to sort of mirror the ladder of life. And that was an interesting pattern to look at. And then finally, geologists realized that the geological processes that we see today, like erosion, the effects of wind, the effects of heat, all of these kinds of things, could be projected into the past to explain past geological processes. And so this is something that a Scottish geologist by the name of James Hutton, who's also known as the father of geology, really brought to the forefront. He came to the conclusion that these natural geological processes we observe today, like a stream cutting through a stream bank and becoming bigger and deeper, like that kind of stuff, could be used to explain past geological processes. And so this idea that the present processes that we see could be projected into the past, that they had been occurring for long periods of time and could explain the features that we saw around us, was known as uniformitarianism. And so looking at the world this way convinced Hutton that the Earth must be very old, because all of the processes that we observe today are very slow. You know, it takes a long time for a stream to erode a riverbank and become a larger river. And so since these things take a while, a lot of time has to have passed to create the geological formations we see today, like say the Grand Canyon, for example. And so a number of other geologists, primarily a guy named Charles Lyell, who was a contemporary and friend of Darwin, for example, picked up the torch that Hutton sort of lit in this sense, and published books about uniformitarianism that really started making people like Darwin think about the Earth as being far older than it was previously called. So Charles Darwin is obviously the most important figure in terms of our understanding of evolutionary history, and that's for a number of reasons. He wasn't the only person to deduce the mechanisms underlying the biological diversity that we see today. We'll talk a little bit about another guy, Alfred Russel Wallace, who also made the same insights that Charles Darwin did. But he also presented his arguments in a really comprehensive and convincing fashion. So not only did he have this idea, but he convinced practically the entire biological community in a pretty short span of time that his ideas were correct. This is especially intriguing when you think about what the standard operating explanation of biological diversity had been before, that it was primarily supernatural, that it was primarily religious, that it had to do with special creation among Western thinkers, and that what he was proposing was diametrically opposed to this and basically would be considered by many to be heretical. But Charles Darwin is a guy who, you know, he was born with a lot of advantages in life so that he could be somewhat more confident about rocking the establishment than some other people might have been. He was born in 1809, and he grew up as a comfortably well-to-do English gentleman. Throughout his life, he never exactly held a job. So he had a lot of time and personal freedom to pursue his intellectual exploits to the great benefit of all of us. First, you know, when he was a young man, he tried his hand at med school, so he had some background in the biological sciences, but he didn't really like medical school that much. If you remember, you know, back then, there was no anesthesia during operations, so watching surgery made him nauseated. It was just not something that was up his alley. He dropped out of med school for the same reasons that many modern medical students drop out of med school. So he dropped out of med school and decided to join the clergy. Maybe seems like kind of ironic given what he ended up doing with his life. But while he was at Cambridge studying to become a man of the cloth, he became, as did many other young men of his time period, interested in natural history and geology. So back then, if you were a well-to-do young man and you had time on your hands, it was considered very desirable to sort of get out there and walk the hills and see nature and all of that kind of stuff. And so while they were out there, people of Darwin's class would do things like collecting beetles or collecting plants and stuff like that, and describing them and drawing them and determining exactly what species they were. Basically, it was this sort of pursuit is exactly what the game Pokemon Go was based on, essentially. If you're playing Pokemon Go, which I don't even know if it's popular anymore, everyone was playing it like 6 months ago, it doesn't seem like anyone's playing it now, but if you're going out there and you're trying to catch them all, that's essentially what these guys were doing. They were competing with each other. They were like, hey, I found 5 beetles yesterday and they were all different species. Hey, I found 8 and they were all different species. So that's what they did in their spare time for fun. But for him, it was more than just a hobby. It became something that turned into a passion. So in 1831, he got himself a position on a ship called the HMS Beagle, which the British Navy was sending on a 5-year expedition with the goal of charting the waters of South America. So the primary goal of this voyage was not to catalog biological diversity, but ships of this time always included, other than the captain, at least one young man who was of privileged socioeconomic class. And the reason for this was that in general on these ships, you know, they had the captain, they had a crew, and the crew was primarily drawn from the lower classes, and the captain was usually drawn from the higher classes. And it was considered very inappropriate for him to be interacting with the lower class crew members of his ship. So in order to keep the captain from going completely insane by not talking to anybody on his ship, which, you know, he could do but wouldn't do because it just wasn't done back then, they would include a Darwin on each ship, a guy who came from a good family and was educated and witty and could engage the captain in conversation. So Darwin was basically hired for this reason. And while he was on the ship, he also served as an informal naturalist. Now, he actually wasn't the appointed naturalist on the ship. On these ships, the medic was supposed to be the naturalist, like whoever the ship doctor was. But since this was an interest of his, this was what he ended up doing. And while he was on this trip, and you can see the trip on this slide, it's this crazy trip. Like, imagine being on the ship. Like, this is not like a cruise liner. This is a ship that has no electricity on it, no running water. You had chamber pots to go to the bathroom. You had no refrigeration, so pretty much none of your food was fresh unless it was still alive while it was on board. I mean, this was not an easy trip, despite the fact that, you know, he came from a pretty cushy background, and for the time, it was probably about as well appointed as these kinds of boats would have been. They traveled to South America. They traveled to some small islands. They traveled to areas in Australasia, as well as the tip of Africa, before heading back to England over a course of, again, 5 years. And so what he did was observe the animals and plants that they encountered during their trips, and he collected some of them and thought about them. And what struck Darwin the most about the organisms that he was seeing were the patterns of variation that he saw in the populations that he observed. So he observed things like the distributions of animals on groups of islands, like the Galapagos, for example, and he would notice that although the animals on the different islands were very similar in some ways, the way that they differed made sense in terms of the environments they lived in. So birds that lived on islands where the best food source was a hard-shelled nut had these really deep, strong bills that would be good for cracking nuts, whereas those birds that lived on islands where the best food source was insects would have these little thin woodpecker-like bills that were suited to making holes and snapping up insects, like that kind of thing. And because these birds, like finches, for example, were very similar in many other ways, he, or I should say his ornithological friends who analyzed the specimens that he brought back when he got back to England, noticed that these birds were actually all closely related, despite the fact that they were very different in terms of some features, and that maybe they had even been descended from the same ancestor. So this sort of variation was at odds with the typological thinking that was current at the time. It didn't make sense that these sorts of birds would be related to each other and just slightly modified for different environments if everything had been specially created. Like, why would you take a finch if you were creating biological diversity and just kind of tweak it for all these different islands instead of making something new? And so after he got back, he had made all of these observations and seen that the patterns of distribution of organisms didn't necessarily concord with what you would expect to find if everything had been specially created and if everything was completely unchanging. So he went back to his well-appointed house in England, and he married his cousin, a Wedgwood of Wedgwood China fame. So, you know, they had a pretty nice nest egg. And then he spent the rest of, you know, the next 20 odd years or so, basically thinking about his ideas and writing them up and conducting dozens of experiments to basically support the arguments that were taking shape in his head. Experiments having to do with breeding pigeons, soaking seeds in salt water to see how long they could survive in the ocean, to explain how islands would become populated by new plants if they were newly formed, you know, that kind of thing. And so he was there and he worked on this, but he was always a little bit trepidatious about publishing what he had found and what he was thinking about, because it was basically literally heretical, and he was worried about the sensation that it would cause, and he didn't want to present his arguments until he felt he had an airtight case. So among other things, he did a lot of domestic pigeon breeding. This was what he decided to throw himself into, and there's actually a really delightful section where he describes his getting into the whole pigeon fancy in On the Origin of Species, and how struck he was by the massive quantity of variation there is among different pigeons. But that also, not only do you see these wide variations in modern pigeons, which if they were in the wild would certainly be considered to be separate species, it was also equally clear that all of these different varieties that you can see pictured here had all descended from a single ancestor, which is the common rock dove, or basically your generic pigeon that you see pecking your way around every city. And so his understanding of biological diversity among domesticated organisms and the fact that you could select for different characteristics and end up with several generations down the line a population of animals that was very different from what the ancestor looked like, suggested to him that this was the same kind of thing that could have happened in nature. and that nature would in fact probably be much more powerful in this sense. So he was at home doing these experiments and breeding his pigeons and writing and thinking and raising his family. And during this time, there was another guy who was also going out there into the wild, basically, and doing field work and making observations which were complementary to what Darwin had made in many different ways and were really sort of essential to our understandings today of modern biogeography, which is the patterning of biological diversity over space, basically. And his name was Alfred Russel Wallace. So he was a contemporary of Darwin. He was like a half generation younger. And despite the fact that his interests were very similar to what Darwin's were, his background was extremely different. So Alfred Russel Wallace was solidly working class. He was not born into money. He was not really expected to become educated. He had interests in that sense, obviously, but because his family didn't have a whole lot of money, his father fell on hard times when he was a young child, he had to quit school when he was 14. And go into work. So first he was apprenticed as a carpenter, then he had to be fired by his own brother as carpenter because the economy became so bad that his brother basically couldn't afford him. And he went off and became a school teacher in the town of Leicester and started reading at the public library there and basically becoming very interested in natural history and started doing the same sorts of things that Darwin had been doing, like walking the hills and collecting beetles and being interested in the biological diversity around him. And he had read Darwin's memoirs of his voyage on the Beagle, as well as many other similar works that were published at the time. And he was inspired by Darwin and other naturalist world travelers and resolved to follow in their footsteps. But since he wasn't upper class like Darwin, he didn't have the same venues. Like no one was going to hire him as a companion to a ship's captain. And so to make a very long story short, basically what he did was he became a commercial collector. So back then, and this is actually still true now, you could make a, I don't know, decent living, but kind of hard living, but you could make money by collecting biological specimens, particularly those that were considered, you know, especially beautiful or rare, and selling them to people who would collect them and display them in their homes. And so he did this in order to pay his way to different places around the world. So first he went to the Amazon, where he learned a lot about the biological distribution of organisms and made tons and tons of field observations and filled up notebooks and collected hundreds or maybe even thousands of specimens, most of which went up in flames on the ship that he commissioned to take them back to England for him at the end of his 4-year tenure there, which, you know, set him back quite a bit. But since he lost almost all of the work that he had done while he was in the Amazon, you know, a lesser person may have given up at that point, but he said, I'm going to go somewhere else, to the Malay Archipelago and repeat my work there. So he went to the Malay Archipelago, which we now know as essentially Indonesia and some surrounding areas, and did field work there for 8 years. And so he went and he collected commercially and also made naturalistic observations while he was there, which are still critical to our understanding of evolution today. So on this slide, you can see an example of what one of these like commercial collectors cases looks like. So this is from a website called butterflyutopia.com. You can actually still go online and order, you know, a case of birdwing butterflies or morphos or swallowtails or whatever you're interested in that are collected in the wild by commercial collectors who will preserve them and put them on little pins and stick them in this lucite box and send them to you. So people were interested in this kind of stuff during the 18th century as well. And it was much more of a wealthy collector's sort of game because obviously at that time it was far more difficult to obtain these sorts of specimens, and they would be accordingly much more expensive. So this is how Wallace made a living while he was in the Amazon and then later in the Malay Archipelago. And the reason why he made the insights that he made while he was there was in large part because he was collecting commercially, that the animals that he was collecting were meant to pay his way through his journeys. This is something that Darwin didn't have to do. So when Darwin did his collections, he would maybe go on to an island group and collect one of each species that he observed while he was there. Not only that, but he didn't even tag a lot of them as to what location exactly they came from, so that when he got back to England, he sort of realized like, oh no, I don't know where these birds came from, so I can't reconstruct their distribution across space and all that kind of stuff. There was a lot of lost information there. But for Wallace, this kind of information was important to have. So he would collect redundantly. In other words, if there was a particular species that was worth a lot, like these showy butterflies or some really pretty iridescent bird or something like that, he would collect multiples of them. And so when you collect multiples of them, you start realizing that there actually is a lot of variation within species, that rather than being a species, rather than being, you know, groups of organisms that were sort of specially created and are churned out, you know, according to a strict template where there's very little variation, as is what you would expect if everything was specially created, you actually see quite a bit of variation. And that when you start observing these patterns of variation, in some cases within species, they start resembling the kinds of patterns of variation that you might see between species. And so the fact that collecting multiple individuals from populations is important is why, if you go back into the stacks of a natural history museum, like what you see on this slide, this is the Smithsonian, obviously the bird department of the collections of the Smithsonian, and you start opening drawers up back there, you will see sometimes dozens or maybe even hundreds of specimens from a single species. And it can be depressing. You know, I've done this myself studying monkeys, and you open up all these drawers and there's just dozens of dead, adorable monkeys, and they're stretched out into these Superman positions and stuffed, and you immediately sort of think like, God, why did they have to kill so many of these things? One of the reasons is that there's a lot of variation that is not captured in the database that you see in these drawers and in similar drawers in museums across the world if you only collect one or two of each species. You don't have any idea of what sorts of variation there might be within a species until you do this sort of redundant collecting. And so Wallace, due to his really unprivileged background, was privileged to make these observations that somebody like Darwin, who didn't have to do this, didn't immediately make while he was traveling. So a guy who was really important to the thinking of both Darwin and Wallace was an economist named Thomas Malthus. And so Thomas Malthus wrote a book called Essay on the Principle of Population, which, as you can see, was published in 1798, so long before either Darwin or Wallace went on their trips around the world. But this was a very important book that sort of stayed in print for a while and was read by many intelligent people. And in it, Malthus argued that, you know, basically, if you look at human population growth, it is very rapid, you know, in certain contexts, it can be exponential. And that since human populations can increase so rapidly, so quickly, it stands to reason that eventually, if human populations keep growing at this rate, they will outstrip the resources that are available to them. So his conclusion was kind of a big buzzkill, basically, that he looked around the world and he said, wow, people are breeding really quickly. If we don't do something about this, then eventually we're going to have some sort of catastrophic famine and people are going to die. Right. So he turned out to be wrong about that. He didn't count on the fact that agricultural techniques would keep evolving and that now we actually produce more food than all of the people on the planet need. There are still starving people in the world, obviously, but it's a distribution problem, not a production problem. So he was wrong about that at least in the way that he framed his argument. But he made an argument that really resonated with Darwin and also with Wallace, both of whom read his book. And so basically, if you take Malthus's argument and you extend it, then it becomes clear that, you know, in a context where you have population growth outstripping the resources like food and water and territory and stuff that the individuals in that population will need, eventually some of the members of that population are going to live and some of them are going to die. And so if everyone is not going to live to survive and reproduce, then there must be an explanation for why some make it and some don't. In other words, it's probably not completely random. There are probably characteristics that some members of the population have that allow them to live through the catastrophe, whereas other members of the population who lack these characteristics are going to be the ones who die. And so reading this book was an aha moment for Darwin and for Wallace. For Wallace, there's this sort of apocryphal story that he was lying in a hut somewhere in Indonesia with malaria or something, and he read this book and he had this sort of fever dream and popped up out of his bed and said, like, oh my gosh, I've solved the mystery of mysteries. I understand how biological evolution occurs now. But, you know, we don't know if that story is actually true, although it's a nice story. But it is true that these arguments presented by Malthus were very instrumental to the understandings of Darwin and Wallace, and that allowed them to formulate their ideas about how biological evolution would occur. And so in Darwin's case, and he was spurred to publish partly by hearing from Wallace, who was still in the Malay Archipelago at the time and had been an admirer of Darwin and having these ideas about, you know, how populations might evolve, and actually wrote a letter to Darwin and said, I have these crazy ideas about how biological change might occur over time. What do you think of this? And Darwin read the letter and kind of freaked out because he thought he was going to get, you know, scooped in terms of publishing these ideas that he had been having for 20 years. But there's a debate over whether Darwin sort of robbed Wallace of the credit that he should have gotten for these ideas, and that's something that could be the topic of, you know, several lectures by itself. But the short version of the story of the dissemination of evolutionary theory to the field of biology is that in 1859, Darwin published a book, it's like 400 odd pages long, called On the Origin of Species, by means of natural selection, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's got a long title actually, where he presented a long extended argument supporting not only the idea that biological evolution had occurred, in other words, that populations, that the organisms that populate the earth had changed over time, that if we went back in time, we wouldn't see exactly what we see today. Not only had this occurred, but he also proposed an explanation for how this could occur. And so in this book, he presented two major theses or arguments, and they were both revolutionary at the time because, again, remember, everybody thought that everything had been specially created, and that the earth was young, and that had been the same way that it was today ever since the beginning of time. So he argued first that all species are related by common descent. In other words, that they were actually relatives of each other, that they hadn't all been created de novo, like this bird here and this bird here. And yeah, they're both red and they're shaped kind of the same way, but it's completely has nothing to do with their actual relationships to each other. They've each been specially created by themselves. He, in opposition, said, no, if you see similarities between organisms, it makes sense that they are more closely related to each other, the same way that you're more closely related to your brother or sister than you are to your second cousin twice removed or something like that, and that they had descended from one or a few original forms of life. Today, we understand that every living thing on the planet probably descends from a single common ancestor, which sounds crazy if you think about it, because this includes us, it includes plants, it includes mushrooms, it includes bacteria, for example. But the fact that we share certain characteristics like DNA or RNA, for example, indicate that at some point, if you go back far enough in the evolutionary past, those are characteristics that we inherited from a distant common ancestor and that we therefore all have. So all species are related by common descent. They've not all been specially created separately. And the second major thesis is that natural selection, leading to what Darwin and what we call adaptation, is the major mechanism of evolutionary change. So ultimately, the reason why we sort of worship Darwin and why Wallace has sort of been forgotten, despite the fact that he did a lot of really important field work and also came up with these ideas, is that Darwin went to the trouble of writing this book and presenting it, and also it was probably received more favorably than a book by Wallace would have been. Wallace was still in the Malay Archipelago at this time anyway, that the publication of this book and the extended argument in it and the overwhelming evidence that he concluded in it had the remarkable effect of convincing practically the entire biological community that evolution had actually happened by, the time 1900 rolled around. So it's really kind of impossible to overstate what a revolution of thinking this was. And this is something that we can owe to Darwin's hard work. So the concept of adaptation is something that's still really important for us to understand in terms of the biological diversity around us, because it explains why the organisms we see around us seem to be suited to the environments that they live in and to the ways that they make living. So we can think of adaptation in two different ways. First, we can think of it as an evolutionary process. In other words, it's a thing that happens over time and that can be observed in the context of changes in biological characteristics that occur over generations. So when I say over time, I don't mean like within a single lifetime, but over several lifetimes in a population that make its members better able to solve the problems posed by the environment over time. So say you have an environment that is cold and is becoming colder. And if you observe a population of animals long enough, you may see that they start acquiring more and more and more characteristics over time that seem to make them suited to being in the cold, like subcutaneous fat or thicker fur or something like that. So these sorts of changes. Second, you can look at adaptation as a feature of an organism. So these sorts of characteristics that become more and more common in populations over time and that seem to be correlated with the environmental demands that the population lives in are the features that can also be described as adaptations. So you can think of an adaptation as a noun as well. So this would be a trait or capacity that would be interpreted as a product of this process of adaptation. And today we understand these traits as being traits that enhance evolutionary fitness. Right? And I'll discuss what fitness means exactly in a few slides. So Darwin outlined a process that he referred to as natural selection, and that we still refer to as natural selection. And he called it natural selection because he wanted to differentiate it from the process of selection that, say, animal breeders do in a domestic context. So if you're breeding dogs, for example, and you want them to be bigger because you like bigger dogs, then you select the individuals among your kennel that are larger and you breed them and you get bigger and bigger dogs over time. So that's artificial selection. That's something that animal breeders do all the time. But nature also applies selective forces to populations. So this is natural selection. And this is something that has been observed actually occurring in nature in a number of different contexts. And so a classic example is shown on this slide. This is a species of moth known as the English peppered moth, or Biston bechellaria, which you'll find in every single textbook of evolutionary biology that you find. It's also pictured on the front of the Lewontin article that I gave you for the assignment for this week. This is a moth that comes in two color forms. Its population. One of them is dark that you see on the bottom, and one of them is light. And so before the Industrial Revolution in Great Britain, the light-colored form was far more common than the dark-colored form. But as the Industrial Revolution went on, sorry, one of my dogs is trying to hawk up hairball in the carpet back there. As the Industrial Revolution went on, the levels of pollution became higher and higher, and the surfaces that moths rested on, so these were buildings, they were rocks, they were tree trunks from light trees that had light-colored bark, these surfaces became darker and darker as they became more and more polluted. And so over time, the dark-colored form of the moth became far more popular, far more common in the populations of the English peppered moth, for probably the obvious reason that a white moth sitting on a dark surface was extremely visible and therefore much more likely to die due to predation. And then interestingly enough, as the Industrial Revolution wound down and pollution became a problem that people tried to solve and therefore started reducing over time into the modern era, as pollution decreased, the white form of the moth is actually coming back again because everything in Britain is no longer covered in soot. So this is an example of natural selection leading to adaptation in the population. In other words, the prevalence of one feature, the light color or the dark color, becoming more frequent over time because of the environmental context that the population lives in. So this sort of thing happens in nature and can be observed if there are three conditions present. And natural selection leading to adaptation is essentially inevitable if these three conditions are present. In other words, we think of this as almost algorithmic. You know, as long as you have these features happening, it will happen like a machine. So the first feature that is necessary is that there has to be variation between individuals in the population. They can't always be invariant. They can't all be invariant in terms of the feature that you are looking at. So let's say we're looking at moth color. If every single moth in the population was white when the Industrial Revolution came around, likely all of them would eventually have been eaten and the species would have gone extinct. There has to be some of the desirable variation, or the fortunate variation, basically present in the population in order for selection to occur. If there's no variation, then selection has nothing to select from. So variation is extremely important. And the importance of variation is one of the observations that Wallace made during his fieldwork. The second requirement is that the variation is heritable. So there are a lot of ways that we can vary in our external phenotype, or basically in our observable characteristics, that are not necessarily heritable. You know, if you go on vacation during reading break somewhere warm and sunny and you come back with a tan, then that is skin color variation, which is not necessarily heritable. Like if you were to have a baby right then, it's not going to pop out with a tan as well. There is some heritable variation obviously underlying this. Some people can tan more than other people, but the actual fact of being tan is not in and of itself heritable. Just like if you are a bodybuilder and you happen to have really large muscles, your baby is not going to pop out looking like an action figure. So if you cut your hair, that your children are not going to come out with the same haircut as you, you know, that kind of stuff. So the variation has to be heritable. Today, we understand this to mean that it must have a genetic basis. And the genetic bases of this phenotypic variation, basically what is encoded in the DNA versus what we can actually observe outwardly when we observe an organism in the field, for example. The relationships here and how we can understand evolution at the genetic level is what we'll be studying in this class. So the variation has to be heritable because it has to be able to be passed down from parent to offspring. Otherwise, it's irrelevant for evolution because we're talking about changes in populations over time, wherein the individuals at later time periods are the offspring of individuals from earlier time periods. And then the third criterion is that the variation has to be relevant to differential reproductive success. And what we mean by differential reproductive success, we mean that if you have this feature, you are more likely to successfully have offspring. And that if this is a heritable feature, then that feature, which would be beneficial in this sense, makes your offspring, who inherit it from you, more likely to have offspring of their own, who will inherit that feature from their parents, and so on and so on. So differential reproductive success simply means that some individuals will be more successful at reproducing than others, and that it has to be because of this variation in this feature that we are interested in. And so in all of these cases, we're talking about a specific feature. So it can be something like wing size or wing color, or how tall you are, or what color your eyes are, or how long your fingers are, whatever feature might be relevant here. So changes in these features over time that make individuals more suited for their environments are due to natural selection. So we talked about adaptation as a process and also as a feature. So these adaptations, these traits that we know of or that we believe enhance fitness, are often those traits that we find most striking about organisms. So like the hammerhead of the hammerhead shark, or the feathers on a bird, these things that seem to require special explanation are the features that were explained by Darwin in On the Origin of Species. So it's clear that if we look at organisms and their environments, that some of them are better suited to certain environments than others. Like a dolphin is going to be happier living in the ocean than a cow would be, for example. And you can see that other organisms seem to make sense in terms of the environments they live in. Like camels can have really big flat feet that are good for walking around on shifting sand, and they also basically never need to drink water. You have a lot of many myriad examples of insects that are highly camouflaged in the habitats that they usually live in. You have examples of animals that are native to polar environments who change color as the world becomes snowier and snowier. So in terms of this Arctic fox, that makes it a lot easier for him or her to sneak up on his or her prey. So these sorts of features are the ones that we tend to find the most interesting, and that previous generations and some modern generations explain to themselves in the context of special creation. In other words, the dolphin is shaped like a torpedo because it was made that way specifically by an intelligent creator for its aquatic environment, but that we understand in a scientific context as the product of evolutionary forces. So it's often these features that we're attempting to explain when we look at the evolution of the populations in which they occur. And so all of these are features that would only be selected for if they enhance fitness. So in this context, selection is the process of differential reproduction, that if you have this feature, it makes you more likely, again, to have offspring, and their offspring have offspring, and their offspring have offspring, etc. If you don't have this feature, then you are at a reproductive disadvantage. And that is the process of selection. So oftentimes when we talk about fitness and we talk about selection, you'll have this idea in your head that fitness has something to do with overall physical vigor, that selection is about survival, that if you don't have this feature, if you're selected against, it means you die. You don't have to die to be selected against. I mean, obviously, if you die, you're not going to reproduce, so that would be a way for selection to occur against a particular feature that is present on a particular organism. But really, the important thing is not the death, it is the reproduction. So fitness is sometimes correlated with things like overall strength and vigor, but only to the extent that that strength and vigor makes an individual more likely to reproduce. So in an evolutionary context, fitness is defined solely in terms of differential reproductive success. And what this means is that you can't always predict, just by using sort of your internal biases and common sense, which organisms are going to be the ones that are going to survive. So it's all about how many offspring you have and how many offspring they have, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we look at this in genetic terms, which is what we're going to be doing throughout this class, basically what this means is not so much that you have all of these offspring, but that more of your genetic contribution is present in future generations. In other words, your DNA, your genome, which is unique to you, how much of it is present in future generations of the population that you are a part of. So in a broader sense, in the context of inclusive fitness, or what's known as inclusive fitness, this can include not only your direct offspring, but also, for example, the offspring of relatives. So if you have a sibling, you share 50% of your genetic material, on average, because you have the same parents. So if your sibling has children, then you share 25% of your genetic material with your nieces and your nephews. So in this sense, you can sort of look at equivalent quantities. Like if you have one child, and your brother has two children, his two children are genetically equivalent in similarity to you to your one kid. So it's as good as you having two kids, if that makes sense. So you can also think about fitness not only in terms of specific offspring and characteristics that they carry, but also in terms of the genetic contribution that is present. And this sort of transitioning about thinking about evolution, not only in terms of individuals and of their observable phenotypes, meaning the characteristics that you would be able to observe if you went out into the field and observed them, for example, that you're also thinking about the genetic underpinnings of the hereditary packages that underlie these phenotypes that are passed on to generations, and that fitness and evolutionary change can also be examined at the genetic level, which is what we're going to be doing throughout this class. And so genetics is obviously important to all this because it explains the packages of heredity that are passed on from parent to offspring. This is the way that we pass on our similarities, right? This is why you have biological similarities to your biological parents, why your biological parents' hair color may be the same hair color that you have, like that kind of stuff. The way that they pass that on to you is through DNA, through genetics, through the DNA that you have that was derived from their DNA. So what this does is not only provide the mechanism of heredity by which these favorable characteristics are passed down from generation to generation, as Darwin postulated, but it also explains the origin of biological variation, which we now understand because we know about the structure of DNA and how it replicates, and that's what we're going to be talking about next week. But for our purposes today, the reason why this is important is that Darwin knew that characteristics had to be passed from parent to offspring, but he didn't know how it happened. He knew there had to be some sort of package by which these characteristics were passed down, but he didn't know about DNA, he didn't know about genes and alleles, he didn't know about any of this stuff. So he could deduce that these packages had to exist, but he didn't know what they were. Now we know what they are, so we can directly observe these patterns of heritability at the genetic level and study them in ways that Darwin couldn't, which is basically what the field of evolutionary genetics is. And so this is a field that was opened up, that was really founded by a Moravian monk named Gregor Mendel, who lived in the early 1800s. So if you look at the dates of his lifespan, then you can clearly see that Gregor Mendel was alive at about the same time as Darwin and Wallace, right? And so you might think to yourself, you know, why didn't Darwin know about genetics? Because this guy was around. Well, the problem was that he didn't publish in English. So he did really extensive experiments with pea plants for a number of different reasons. Pea plants are really easy to cultivate. If you've ever grown any in your garden, they're like practically weeds. It's like kind of impossible to kill a pea plant. And they also have a lot of variation among them in terms of things like the shape of the plant, the height of the plant, the shape of the pod, the color of the pod, the colors of the flowers, where the flowers are located. There's a lot of variation and it's easily observable and they're really easy to breed. So he did experiments with pea plants over the course of about 7 years and looked at a total of around 30,000 of these things. So he did some really crazy long-term experiments, and what his goal was to observe the patterns of inheritance of these simple traits that are easy to observe, like color and shape and stuff like that, in order to determine if he could deduce the patterns of heredity underlying them. So patterns of heredity are things that we talk about colloquially all the time. You know, when you try to imagine, you know, if I have blue eyes and my partner has brown eyes, what color would our children's eyes be? What would the pattern of heredity be there? Is it more likely to inherit brown eyes than blue eyes? Are brown eyes quote unquote dominant over blue eyes? It's not that simple, but these kinds of questions are things that we sort of think about casually all the time and that he sought to answer. In other words, if you have a tall plant and a short plant, are the offspring tall or short? If you have a pink flower and a red flower, what do you end up with? So by doing all of these experiments and describing what he observed in each generation, he was able to see that there were some patterns of inheritance that were consistent that he could actually elevate in certain cases to what he called laws. And we'll talk about those in more detail next week. So he published a really important paper describing all of this in 1965, but it wasn't really discovered by the broader Western scientific community until the 1900s, when somebody finally picked it up and translated it in English and said, this stuff is actually really important for understanding the mechanism of heredity that Darwin has proposed at this point about 40 years ago. So Mendel looked at traits like this. He looked at height of the plants, he looked at flower color, flower position, you know, whether they were sort of coming out of the middle of the stalk or the end of the stalk, seed color, shape, pod shape, etc. These are 7 traits. They were easy to observe and they were passed on in pretty simple ways. You didn't have a ton of blending between these traits, for example, that would have confused the matter. So he was able to observe these traits through generations. So here's a hypothetical experimental breeding cross there between tall plants and short plants, for example, and determine things like, well, if you cross a tall plant and a short plant, then you end up with a bunch of tall plants in the second generation. They're all tall. But then if you take that second generation and you cross them, you start getting interesting patterns, like consistently 3/4 of the offspring being tall and 1/4 being short, and that this is something that he would observe over and over again. So based on this, he was able to deduce the packages of heredity that these plants were passing on from parent to offspring, and not only that, but how these packages of heredity interacted and how they must have been contributed to by each parent. So if you have a sexually reproducing organism, you have two parents, you know, the way that we as sexually reproducing organisms in a species that has two sexes are the product of a male and a female, biological male and biological female mating, and each one of them passing on half of their genetic complement to us, the offspring. So these are the kinds of patterns that Mendel deduced by doing these experiments. Now, again, he was unable to directly observe the DNA, the genes, or the alleles, but he was able to deduce that they must be present. So the ideas, the idea that there were these packages, that we could refer to them as genes, that they were passed on in predictable ways from parent to offspring, is something that we can associate with Gregor Mendel, and that we could use to further explain the biological diversity that we see, and why, for example, if you're breeding organisms, you might end up with what you think of as sort of long gone characteristics popping up at random, seemingly random points in your breeding program. That this isn't random, actually, that this has to do with the way that genetic material is passed on. And he was able to determine that in these sort of sexually reproducing organisms, that approximately half of this variation appeared to be accounted for by the contribution of one parent. So, you know, in us, it would be maybe the paternal parent, and half of it was from the maternal parent. And that there were alternatives for different features, and that we could think of these things as being packaged in specific ways. And we now understand these to be genes. So this is, and we'll go into this in more detail in future lectures in case you're confused now, but this is a schematic representation of two chromosomes, which is a way that DNA is packaged in our cells, particularly at the time of of cellular replication. When you have a cell that has a copy of your DNA in it and it splits into two cells, you need to first replicate that DNA and split it up into two copies so that each cell has a complete copy of your DNA, that they become packaged in chromosomes at this time, and that we can think about genes as being portions of the genome that are located in specific places on the genome and therefore end up on specific places in chromosomes. So that's what this is showing you here. It's showing a pair of chromosomes, one of which represents half of your genome for that specific chromosome, the other one is half. And so you have genes for characteristics and two copies of each gene, one of which is inherited from your mother and one of which is inherited from your father. And that the specific character state, or the form of that trait that is encoded for, may not be the same between those two copies. So you can imagine that you have a gene for flower color that is located here, and that this particular plant has one copy that codes for purple flowers and one copy that codes for white flowers. And so these alternatives are known as alleles. I'll talk about this more again over the next couple of weeks. But this sort of structure is something that we can now directly observe, because we can observe the DNA, we can look at chromosomes and all that kind of stuff, but the presence of which Gregor Mendel deduced through his experiments. So basically, by taking Mendel's insights and using them to explain the patterns and processes that Darwin proposed, early in the 20th century, evolutionary biologists came up with what is now referred to as the modern synthesis. So this is basically the melding of Darwinian theory and Mendelian genetics that explain the patterns of heredity that are observed among populations. So the modern synthesis is sometimes referred to as synthetic theory. Sometimes it's referred to as neo-Darwinism. There's a lot of different ways to think about it, but all of these different labels refer to this melding and this inclusion of genetic insights into Darwinian theory. So this sort of evolution of biological theory in and of itself, and the continuing inclusion of more and more genetic insights, is an extension of the modern synthesis. And some biologists think that we should be talking about a modern synthesis, or a new synthesis, or basically a new Darwinian theory that's even newer than the modern synthesis, because we know so much more about genetics and DNA and how it is transmitted and what sorts of patterns are involved in the natural processes that produce and replicate DNA, that all of these insights that we have now come so far from what we understood in the early 1900s that we should be thinking of it as a completely new generation of biological theory. That's really where we are now. So in a lot of ways, what we're looking at now is no man's land, not no man's land exactly, but a new frontier, I guess, where the technology is evolving so rapidly that our understandings of genetics are changing almost on a weekly basis. So hopefully I'll be able to give you a little bit of an understanding so that you can get on that roller coaster basically and start riding it and following exactly what's happening. So in terms of the mechanisms of evolution, are the ones that underlie the changes that we see over generations in population, we now have been able to deduce that there are at least 4 very important such mechanisms. So I've spent some time talking about adaptation in this lecture, and these are, and again, we will clarify this in future lectures in terms of genetic effects. So if you don't get this right now, you can review the readings that I've given you. I'll be returning to this in future lectures. The first 2 are mutation and selection. So mutations are changes to the genetic code that occur during normal processes of DNA replication that basically are the raw material for variation, basically. So any sort of biological variation that is ultimately observed in the phenotype of organisms and populations ultimately came from mistakes that were made at the level of DNA replication. So this is where variation comes from. This is why individuals and populations are not exactly, this is part of the reason why individuals and populations are not exactly the same as each other, even if they're really closely related to each other. So mutation is a generator of variation, while selection, which we talked about in the context of natural selection, is that which winnows through this variation produced by mutation and gives you the resulting generations and populations that we observe. So mutation and selection are thought of as Darwinian forces because they can lead to adaptation. But there are other forces of evolution that cause biological change in populations over time that is not adaptive. In other words, there's variation that occurs over generations that cannot be explained in terms of fit to the environment or selective forces. And that falls under the category of 2 non-Darwinian forces of evolution, which we refer to as gene flow and genetic drift. I'm not going to spend more time talking about them now because we're going to talk about them in future lectures, but the important thing to know about them now is that gene flow and genetic drift are other mechanisms of evolution that don't have anything to do with natural selection and that lead to biological change but do not lead to adaptation. So the take-home message of that is that all of the biological variation that you see within and between populations cannot be explained by adaptation. In other words, everything is not adaptive. So this is important because not only when we are looking at phenotypes that we can observe in nature, but also when we're looking at genotypes and trying to determine what sorts of evolutionary forces explain the patterns of variation we see at the genetic level, it's important to remember that not everything is adaptive and that there are different evolutionary explanations that can be used to interpret what we see. So again, there are 4 forces of evolution, only 2 of which lead to adaptation, and that there are a lot of features that are shaped by evolution, by patterns of biological change and distribution in the past, as well as the interactions of individuals and populations that lead to biological change. In other words, if you went back in time and observed the population that you're now observing, they wouldn't be exactly the same as they are now, but that are not adaptive, that are the result of what is often referred to as random factors, although by random in this context we mean non-selective, that they don't have to do with natural selection, but they do have to do with these other evolutionary forces. So not necessarily random in the way that you think of random, but random with respect to adaptation and the needs of the organism in a particular environment. And this is really important to remember because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, a lot of the features of organisms that we think are the most striking tend to be those features that we interpret as adaptations. And in turn, it is very tempting in many cases to look at all of the variation in an organism and say, well, this must have something to do with adaptation. So I don't know if you pay attention to the science news, but like 6 months ago, some researchers from Paris published some long-term observations that they had of frigate birds, which are these seagoing birds that you can see on the slide. And they found out all sorts of remarkable things about them. Like these birds can stay aloft for weeks or even months at a time without ever landing. It's because they're oceanic birds and they don't actually have waterproof feathers. A lot of oceanic birds like gulls and stuff like that have waterproof feathers that are oily so they can actually sit on the water so they can rest even if there's no land. But frigate birds can't do this. They just have to keep flying until they get to land. So not only do these birds fly for like literally weeks or months at a time, they're so good at gliding that one individual was observed going 40 miles without ever beating its wings. They apparently sleep while they're flying. They can fly as high as 12,000 meters, which is like completely insane. They do all these really crazy things. And obviously one of the features that facilitates their ability to do this are those feathers, which albeit not waterproof, are pretty much necessary for flight. So if you look at frigate birds and you look at many other birds, it seems very clear to any casual or even non-casual observer that the feathers on a bird are adaptations for flight. I mean, if you look at a bird's wing, it's incredibly intricately put together. You know, not only is it built a certain way, but it has all of these feathers. And these feathers are all different shapes and sizes, and they're distributed just so in ways that make it very useful for aerodynamics, basically, that you have these primary feathers that make up the bulk of the surface of the wing that interacts with the air and allows the bird to fly. But you have all these other little feathers too that can be differentially sort of positioned and fluffed up and stuff so that the bird can do various maneuvers in the air. Even something as lame as your average pigeon that you see out there can do incredible things in the air. They're actually really excellent flyers. It's one of the reasons why they're all over the place, all over the world. So you look at the wing of a bird and you look at those feathers and you say, this clearly is an adaptation for flight. The reason that birds have feathers is because they fly, right? So seems like a pretty clear-cut example of adaptation. But if you follow the science news, you have also probably learned that the more and more dinosaurs we discover from certain fossil contexts where preservation is really good, a lot of these dinosaurs come from China, like this one, we start finding that a lot of dinosaurs that clearly didn't and couldn't fly also had feathers. So this is one of the most famous feathered dinosaurs out there, Sinosauropteryx. It was covered with these little downy sort of proto-feathers that are very similar in structure to the underfeathers that you would find on any bird today, but that clearly are not used for flight in this sense. And in every early case where feathers are found in dinosaurs, they are not used in the context of flight. Like this animal could not have flown. It doesn't have the right kind of feathers. It's not built the right way. None of this. So clearly, feathers did not originally evolve for the purpose of flight. This is a really cool case because researchers have actually been able to microscopically analyze the melanosomes that are present in the fossils of these feathers, not meaning that the actual pigment cells are still there, but that the structures can be observed microscopically in the feathers that have been found in the fossil record and in the impressions of the feathers. And we're able to reconstruct what this animal may have been colored like, which is, you know, looks sort of like this weird little raccoonish ring-tailed lemur thing. But clearly wasn't a flying animal. And another very large dinosaur that was clearly too big to fly and was one of the earlier feathered dinosaurs that was only discovered you know, a couple decades ago, was covered by similar sorts of downy feathers, even much more abundantly than Sinosauropteryx was, again, clearly not in the context of flight. So you don't see feathers that look like the animal could use them to fly, coupled with a body structure that could fly until relatively late in the paleontological record of feathers. So what this indicates is that actually, despite the fact that they seem to be really perfectly adapted for flight, that's not why feathers actually evolved. And so this is only one example of how everything can't simplistically be explained as an adaptation to the environment in which the organism currently lives. Because clearly feathers evolved in a context over 65 million years ago, and in the context of a habitat and a biological niche or way of making a living that's very different from what any bird does today. So this sort of cautionary tale that every feature that you look at cannot be explained as an adaptation to the current environment that the organism lives in today, is something that Gould, Stephen Jay Gould, famous evolutionary biologist, rest in peace, and Richard Lewontin published in 1979 in a really important paper called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm. I'm not going to translate that title for you now. If you're interested in what exactly the Panglossian Paradigm is and you're not familiar with Voltaire, then, you know, a couple of Google searches will bring you that information very rapidly. But the important metaphor here is that of the spandrel, which apparently is also a faulty architectural analogy because spandrels aren't exactly how they presented them in the paper. But for our purposes, I'll just present their argument, which is that if you go and you look at a lot of classical architecture, during certain periods of time in Europe, you see these very highly decorative triangular areas known as spandrels that are placed between arches, and they're usually quite beautiful, and oftentimes really important things are painted on them and stuff like that. So you might say that this is a feature that architects included on purpose in order to make their buildings more beautiful, that this is something that was purposely put there by the architect. But in fact, spandrels are really just sort of byproducts of certain kinds of arch designs. In other words, if you have a bunch of arched walls and they come together, then necessarily you end up with these triangular spaces between them. And then they might end up being decorated after the fact because they happen to be there, but that's not why they were there in the first place. And so what they're basically saying here is that there are a lot of biological features of organisms, even those that are conspicuous or interesting, like hammerheads on hammerhead sharks. Sorry, I keep on going back to that one because there's seriously, like, you look at hammerhead sharks the first time, you're just like, why are you not pointing like a normal shark? But anyway, these sorts of features are the ones that are most often unquestioningly interpreted as adaptations. Like, this is so unusual and striking, it must be adapted. And then they argue that these then you basically start with this adaptive explanation and you make up a just so story to explain it without really examining it in a scientific sense. And this is something that they refer to as the adaptationist program, basically that this was the mindset that everybody was in, that everything would be an adaptation, and that if you find an interesting feature, you just sort of explain it using some plausible story, and then you're done in terms of science. And what they argued, and that I agree with, and that most biologists agree with today, at least intellectually, even if in practice we don't always do this, is that interpreting features as adaptations should be treated not as sort of a done deal, but as a hypothesis that must in turn be tested. In other words, if you look at the feathers on a bird, you can say, well, they look like they're adapted for flight, but are they? Is this the context in which they originally evolved? Or are they something that evolved in a different context that happens to be used for flight now, which is something that Gould and Lewontin referred to as an exaptation, so E-X-A-P-T, aptation. So, which is a very different interpretation from saying that they evolved specifically for the purpose that they are used for now, and tells you something about the evolutionary history of that characteristic that has been deduced and elucidated by the findings of fossils of dinosaurs, which are the ancestors of birds. Actually, birds are dinosaurs. They're basically surviving dinosaurs that are still flying around us today, that they have inherited and then co-opted for another use. And so if we look for these more nuanced explanations, we can have a more detailed understanding about evolution and how it works. And this is especially important when we look at genetic data, because in many cases, the genetic variation that we look at is not completely understood. In other words, we might have a segment of DNA and we don't know if there are any genes on it. We don't know what it does. We don't know if it codes for anything. We just know that it varies between one individual organism and another. And so explaining that variation requires a series of hypotheses that have to be rigorous and testable. And that's one of the reasons why I think understanding the scientific method is so important. And so when we look at the genetic data, we understand that, like the phenotypic data, the genetic characteristics of organisms are characteristics that are the product of evolutionary forces. In other words, we have a chimpanzee, a mouse, a banana, and a fruit fly on this slide. At some point in our evolutionary past, we have a common ancestor. If you go back far enough in time, there is a species that is the common ancestor of all of us, from which we inherited certain characteristics. So despite the fact that we're very different from each other, we have some characteristics that, like, the red hair that you might have inherited from, great grandpa Frank or something like that. If you go back far enough in time, you had an ancestor of all of these very disparate organisms that had DNA. The structure of DNA is very complex. It's not something that would just happen randomly in multiple lineages. This is something that we've inherited from a common ancestor. The structure of our cells, the fact that nuclei are present there, things like that, very deep similarities between us are those that are inherited from common ancestors. And so we can also look at this at the genetic level. Now, there are a number of different ways to compare genomes to each other. So, people will say sort of colloquially, well, we're 99% genetically identical to chimpanzees. And that's true if you look at the genome a certain way, because there's a bunch of different ways that you can quantify similarity. Like, you can just look at the specific code of the genome and compare us to chimpanzees and quantify it that way. You can compare the number of genes that we share in common, for example. You can compare the positioning of those genes. Are they on the same chromosomes in us as they are in chimpanzees? All of these will give you slightly different estimates. So that's why you'll see varying estimates of similarity in the biological literature. So I don't want you to get confused. But if we look at these varying estimates of ancestry, then we find that chimpanzees and humans are anywhere between 96 and 99% genetically identical to each other. You know, this doesn't seem that intellectually hard to accept, right? We're obviously very similar to chimpanzees. If you've ever gone to the zoo and observed them, you probably had a very sort of uncomfortable feeling because you sort of felt like you were looking at people trapped in there. And that reflects the fact that we're very similar to each other biologically, behaviorally, psychologically, etc. The similarity reflects our very close relationship to each other, and it's reflected at the genetic level. But, you know, we're pretty different from mice, right? Like, you probably don't feel a sense of comradeship with the pet mouse that you have in a cage, or with a pet mouse or a lab mouse that you may have worked with in a research setting. But humans are actually about 84% genetically similar to mice, right? So even more surprisingly, we share approximately 61% of genetic similarity with fruit flies, which is, you know, pretty alien organism. You know, they're really tiny, so we don't think about them that much. But if you think about, like, you know, the way they look and their body parts, like, blow one up to like human size and you have like a horror movie monster. You have Alien, basically. So despite the fact that we're so different from Drosophila, we share about 60% of our genetic material with them. And incredibly enough, we also share about 60% of our genetic material with bananas, right? So these are the sorts of biological patterns that we observe when we look at the genome that we have to explain. Like, we know that this has to have happened due to evolutionary forces, but how the heck is it that we're 60% genetically identical to bananas? And what does that mean exactly? Does it make me a 60% cannibal if I cut one up and eat it on my cereal in the morning? Speaking of cereal, actually 25% genetically identical to wheat. So anyway, these sorts of measurements are interesting and striking and demand explanation, and that's some of the stuff that we're going to be looking at this term. When we look at these similarities, we can interpret them in terms of our evolutionary history. Characteristics that are shared between different species are known as homologies if they are inherited from a common ancestor. So for example, the fact that all of these organisms on the last slide have DNA is a homology. They are characteristics. It is a characteristic that we all have that is, in a sense, the same characteristic. It's known as identical by descent because it's inherited from a common ancestor. It's not like we have different kinds of DNA that evolve differently. Our DNA that we share evolved in the same context and then was passed down to us by our ancestor. And so the extent of the shared homologies that we see, which can be measured in a number of different ways, it reflects our common ancestry. So we can look at a horse and a human and see that despite the fact that we're organized very differently in terms of our body shape and body size, that we share many of the same skeletal elements and that these are homologous. You know, when I was a kid, I noticed very early on that my ankle was very similar to the hock of a horse, which is this joint on the back leg back here. It's actually the same joint as the ankle is on a person. And that if you sort of follow that similarity to different parts of the body, then you see that there are a number of similarities that we share not only with horses, but with other vertebrates, like the fact that our limbs have one upper bone and two lower bones, something that you see quite commonly. In horses, those two lower bones are fused and can be referred to as the digits that you see in the foot are fused to the other bones in the lower leg and can be referred to as splint bones and stuff like that, but some of them are still there. That the neck vertebrae are, despite the fact that they're very different sizes, similar in other ways. They have 7 and we have 7. Actually, giraffes have 7. All of these kinds of things. So you can also look at this at the genetic level. And so that's part of what you're expressing when you say, well, we're 96 to 99% genetically identical to chimpanzees. Those similarities, if they are inherited from a common ancestor, they're not resulting from sort of chance convergent mutations or anything like that, which likely they are not. Those similarities are homologous and represent our common ancestry with each other. And it makes sense that this phenotypic similarity that we see on the outside is reflected by genotypic similarity, and that altogether the evidence indicates that we're incredibly closely related to each other. So these homologies are things that we can look at phenotypically. We can look at them embryologically. If we look at the embryos of many different kinds of vertebrates at comparable stages of development, you see that we look quite a bit alike at early stages. A human and a fish are not very different from each other. This reflects our shared evolutionary history. This is an example of homologies that you can observe at this level. And then finally, you can also observe these homologies at the genetic level. Incredibly, the same genes that are responsible for patterning of the body in Drosophila and fruit flies are the same genes that are responsible for body patterning in us. And this is really critical stuff to development, like deciding which end of you is going to be your head and which end is going to be your butt. If you don't have these genes functioning properly, then obviously you don't develop as a viable embryo. So these genes are, despite the fact that we have been evolutionarily separate for hundreds of millions of years, are still the same in to a certain extent. They've changed a bit, but are still largely similar in fruit flies and in people, to the extent that you can actually plug human copies of the genes into fruit flies and still build a recognizable fruit fly. So this level of homology indicates that despite the fact that we clearly don't share much outward phenotype with fruit flies, that phenotype that we do share reflects our common genetic ancestry as well, like the fact that we have an anterior end and a posterior end, and that we're bilaterally symmetrical. This is not something that should be taken as given for living things. There are living things out there like starfish that are not biologically symmetrical, for example. They're radially symmetrical. Characteristics like this are reflected at the genetic level and represent shared homologies, characteristics that were inherited from a common ancestor, and show that we are related to each other. So comparing these similarities among organisms at the genetic level also provides evidence of evolution, and that can help us reconstruct the events that occurred between the time that our common ancestor was around and now. And that this is some of what we're going to be exploring through the course of the term as well. And that in aggregate, we can take this evidence and correlate it with other lines of evidence about our evolutionary past and use it to reconstruct the events of our evolutionary past, the relationships between us and other organisms. In this case, as you can see, a primate family tree with us at the bottom. Obviously, it's represented by a chimpanzee, but since we're apes too, we're included in that group. And that this is something that we can do in concert with other lines of evidence, including even linguistic evidence, archaeology, paleoanthropological evidence, paleontological evidence, et cetera, and can use evolutionary genetics to reconstruct our history, not only during the time periods that we have other lines of evidence that we can compare it to, but also with more time depth than some of the other sorts of traditional lines of evidence that we use in human evolutionary studies, like paleontological evidence from paleoanthropology, meaning hominin ancestors, or archaeological evidence, with the archaeological record not being more than, say, 3.5 million years old. So all of these lines of evidence together are uniquely informative, but we're going to be concentrating on the genetic lines of evidence for this class to explain these overall patterns that we observe. And that if we go far enough back in time, using these lines of evidence, we can actually try to trace our relationships not only to more closely related organisms like other primates, but also to more distantly related organisms. In fact, every organism that exists on the planet, including the bacteria that gave you that horrible stomach illness over the holiday break or something like that. So it's a lot of information, and we're going to be covering a lot of stuff this term, but I think it's going to be very rewarding and very interesting. And again, I want to encourage you guys to ask as many questions as possible if anything confuses you at any time period, any point during the term. So I'm going to close today's lecture, and I will be present throughout the week looking at your discussion forums and all that kind of stuff, and available by email if you have any questions or problems. Your readings and assignment have been posted, so I wish you luck with those. And again, want to make sure that you know that I'm here for any help that you might need. All right, have a great weekend, everybody.